Welcome to part 14 and the final part of my Blender for Complete Beginners tutorial series. If you haven't watched the previous parts, then definitely check out the tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So this is the final part. So in this part, I'm going to go over some different render settings. I'm going to show you how to actually render the image, and then I'll show you how to use Blender's Compositor, and we'll do some compositing to make the final image look really nice. And then I'll show you how to save your finished renders to an actual image on your computer. And if you'd like to purchase the finished snowman project files, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. Now real quick before we start, I wanted to let you know about a really great render farm service for Blender. Blender Grid is an easy to use render farm specifically designed for Blender. I've used the service and I highly recommend it. Upload your Blender file or a zip file with the blend file and textures. You can change the render settings on the website before rendering. Blender Grid will let you know the cost before you start the render. You can even choose when you want the render to finish if you're on a tight deadline. While it renders, you can check the rendered frames to make sure everything is rendering properly. Once it finishes, just download the files and compile the frames in a video editor. Use the link in the description to get $20 of render credit on your first render. Alright, so let's get the snowman rendered. So I did mention this earlier, but if you go to the output properties, there's going to be the resolution, and the resolution is going to change the camera size. Now there is a percentage here, and this percentage, 100%, is going to be this exact resolution, so 1920 by 1080 pixels. If you turn this down to like 50, it's just going to be half of those pixels, and you can of course turn it smaller. Now if you click on the percentage and you type in like 200, it's going to render with double this resolution. So it's going to double this number on each one of these values. So I'm just going to turn this to 100. So this is really useful if you just want to do like a really quick test render and you want to render it with a smaller size. You could just turn it to like 25% or 50%, but then keep it at 100 for the final render. Now we already went over this in a previous part of the tutorial series, but if you click here on the render settings, you can scroll down here and you can change all the sampling. So I am going to go to the render samples right here, and I'm going to turn on this denoise, and this way it will denoise the image, and so the final render will look much nicer. And then also I'm going to turn this max samples to like 100. If that is taking way too long for your computer to render, you could turn it down. So as I mentioned in the earlier part of the tutorial series, if there are more samples, it's going to do more passes across the image, so it'll get rid of the noise and make the image look nicer and more crisp, but the more samples there are, it'll take longer to render. And then I'll use the noise threshold. You don't have to if you don't want to. I'm going to use the noise threshold so that once it reaches a spot where there isn't that much noise, then it will just finish the render. And then I will be rendering with my GPU. We went over this earlier in the tutorial series, but generally, if you have a GPU, generally a GPU will render much faster than your CPU. Now there's something else that we can do to make it render faster. If I hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view to see the image, we can now go right down here and we can open up the light paths. So click on light paths, and the light paths is only going to be in the cycles rendering engine. So if you're using the Eevee rendering engine, you don't really need to change this because the settings aren't actually there. So the light bounces is how many times the light is going to bounce around the scene. And so because Blender's a ray trace render engine, it actually simulates the light and it bounces the light on the objects and it looks much more realistic. So all of these different values here, these are the different types of light. So there's like diffuse light, and this is just going to be like the color. There's glossy, which is going to be like the reflections. There's transmission and transparent, which is going to be like the transparency, and there's also volume, which is something else which we haven't gotten into in this tutorial series. And so if you turn these down, Blender won't have to calculate as many of the light paths, so it'll render faster. However, if you turn these down too small, then the scene may not look quite as realistic. So this total here, this is going to control all of them. So if I turn the total all the way to 0, you can see that it does look a bit different. It's a little bit darker, and that's because it's not reflecting as much of the light and calculating as much of the light paths. So for example, you can see here there's this reflection on the shiny hat, and that's because the light is shining down here, then it's bouncing off the forehead of the snowman, and it's reflecting right here so the camera can see it. Well, if I turn the total all the way down, it goes away, and if I turn the glossy down, it also goes away, because the glossy is going to be the reflections. So you can see if I turn this down to 3, that still looks fine. If I turn it down to 2, that still looks fine. If I turn it to 1, it still looks fine. But if I turn it to 0, now you can see it goes away. So what we need to do is at least use one amount of glossy. And so that will actually render faster because it only has to do it one time. So for this scene, we can just take this total and we can just turn it to 1. And so this will make the total max bounces just set to 1. And then we could also turn some of the other ones off. So I'm just going to turn the transmission to 0 because we aren't using any transparency. And then this transparent we can turn to 0. And also there's this clamping here. We can turn these down as well. So just turn the indirect and direct light to 0. And there's also this filter glossy here. And this is for other things that we don't need. So we can also turn this to 0. And then there's also these caustics here. This is for creating light caustics, which is something you can learn about later, but I'm going to turn off the reflective and refractive caustics. So the total, we're just going to leave it 1 and the diffuse and glossy to 1, but everything else can be 0. And I do also have a video which I made a while back on how to speed up the Cycles rendering engine if you're rendering a really long animation or a really big image and it's taking a long time to render. So I made that video a little while back, but it's still relevant. So if you'd like to check out that video on how to speed up cycles, you can find that video in the description. Now before you render the image, it's a really good idea to always save. So just press Ctrl S, because sometimes if you render the image, Blender might crash for some reason. Blender might run out of the computer memory, or there might just be a bug or something and Blender might crash. So I always recommend pressing Ctrl S just to save your file before you render. Now to render, the shortcut key is F12, or you can click here on render and you can either render the animation, which will start to render all of the frames, but we just want to render one image because we're not doing any animation, so we'll just choose render image. So when I click on render image, you can see this new window will come up here and it's going to render the image. So it's going to give you some things here, some information to show you what it's doing. So this is the last frame that you rendered, the time of the last frame. This is how long the frame is going to take to render, so it's counting the frame. And then this is also the frame number that you're on. So generally, if you're not doing an animation, it'll probably just be frame 1, or if you're rendering out an animation, then it will show that animation. And there's also the samples right here, so you can see it's almost done, and it's almost hit 100 samples. We're just waiting for that to finish, and now it's done. So you can see here's the frame number, and then here it took 34 seconds to render. It's also showing you like the memory that it used. So in the image editor, you can click with your middle mouse wheel to move around, and you can use your scroll wheel to zoom in, and you can see the image is looking quite nice. And because we used that denoise, it smoothed out the image, so that looks quite nice. So what I'm going to do is just hit the X key to get rid of this temporary window here. And if you click over here on the render tab, you can see it's also going to show us the render result. If for some reason it isn't showing the render result, you can click on the drop down and then you can start to type in render result and just click on that. So the image is looking pretty nice and we could just save it now, but before I do that, I want to show you how to use Blender's compositor. We'll do a little bit of compositing to kind of add a few effects to the final image. So we can click here on the compositing layout and this will take us to Blender's compositor. Let's just drag this down by clicking and dragging down because we don't really need the timeline. I can also press the N key to close that side panel. Now, compositing uses nodes, and it's similar to the procedural shader nodes, but the nodes are different. Let's click on this button here, which is Use Nodes. And when you click on that, you can see there's going to be 2 nodes here. So you can see it's using the node system, which is very similar to the shader nodes. So there is this render layers, and it should show you a preview here of the render layer. So the render layer is what it's rendered. You can also click on this little button here to get rid of that preview if you don't want it. Now you can also click on this backdrop here to see the backdrop. Now the backdrop isn't there, and that is because we need to add what's called a viewer node to preview what it's seeing. So we enabled the Node Wrangler add-on earlier in the tutorial series, but if for some reason it's not enabled, you can click here on Edit, and you can go to the Preferences, and then in Blender's User Preferences, go to Add-ons. You can go to the search here and type in Node, and you can enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and then you can click on Save Preferences so it is always turned on. We can close the user preferences. So now that the Node Wrangler is enabled, you can hold down the Control and Shift key, and then you can select different nodes. That is going to add this viewer node, and we can drag the viewer node over here. So the compositing node is actually going to do the compositing, and then the viewer node will actually preview it in the background. So now the scene is in the background, but it's too big. So the settings to change it is the V key. So the V key is going to zoom the background out. And if you want to zoom the background in, you can press Alt V. You can also just click here and you can drag it if you want to make it bigger. And you can drag up here. You can click right here to make it bigger, but I prefer to use V and Alt V. And then also, if you hold down the Alt key while you're middle and clicking, so Alt, middle, click, and drag, that's going to move it around. So when you're doing compositing, you can like have the compositing nodes in front of it. If for some reason you don't like that, you could hold down the Alt key and middle, click, and drag over here, and then you could like work with your compositing nodes right here if you wanted to, but I don't really mind just having the nodes in front, so I'm just going to do that. So this node system works just like the other node system. So it starts out at left, and then the wires make the nodes communicate, and it reads from left to right. So first we have the render layers, then we have the composite in the viewer, and then we can add nodes in between to do the compositing. Now one thing I'm going to do is hold down the shift key and then right click and drag. And I'm going to shift right click and drag over these two wires and let go. This is going to add a reroute, so it's a shortcut key to add a reroute, and now I can move the reroute over here. So basically these wires are now going to connect, so it is one wire. So now we can add nodes into this one wire. So one node which might be very useful if you haven't denoised the image is press Shift A for the add menu. Just like all of the other parts of Blender, you can either click on add to add the different nodes in the compositing, or press Shift A. And one node that might be very useful is the denoise node. So I'm going to click on the denoise. So this will denoise the image. So first we have the render layers, then we're going to tell it to denoise, and then it will composite it. So let's just drop it here. Now we don't actually need the denoise node because we already used the denoise in the sampling, but this will denoise the image. Now when I'm using the denoise node, I prefer to change the accurate to fast because I find that fast renders a lot faster, or it composites a lot faster, but it doesn't really affect the quality. Now when you are compositing, you can see right down there in the very bottom of your screen, it's going to have that little loading bar. And so it's going through and it's calculating all the compositing. You can see if I change anything, that little bar appears, and it usually composites pretty fast, at least for my computer. It may only take a couple of seconds. If you have a lot of nodes and you're compositing a lot of different things, then it will take longer. I'm going to click on this node and I want to delete it. Now a cool shortcut key is to press Control X. So normally if I just hit X and delete, it's going to disconnect the wire and I'd have to plug it back up. But if I press Control X, that'll get rid of the node but keep those wires connected. Now there's another cool node. If you go to the add menu with Shift A, you can search for the transform node. Let's drop this right here. And then with the transform node, you can change the X and you can change the Y. You can also change the angle, and the angle is going to rotate it. And you can also change the scale. So this is a great way to scale your image. And another cool thing you can do, if I just scale this up, is you can mute nodes. So if you select a node, you can press the M key, and that's going to work with any of the different nodes in Blender. So you can see now it is gray and there's kind of a line going through it. So it's just muted. So if you want to see what it looks like kind of before and after, you can just mute the node and see what it looks like. I'll select the transform and press Control X to get rid of it. Now there's also another cool one. If I go to the add menu and go here to the search, I can search for a lens distortion. This is a pretty cool one. Let's drop it here. And with this one, I can turn up the distortion and you can see it's going to kind of rotate it. What I like to use instead, if I click here, I can drag and make it bigger, is I like to use the dispersion. Now this one, I don't really use it most of the time, but if I'm creating some cool like sci-fi artwork, you can add that cool like classic sci-fi lens distortion. So that's kind of a cool effect that you could add. Of course, that's way too strong, but you could turn it to a very small number like a 0.1. So for sci-fi scenes, that would be pretty cool. You could add just a small lens distortion. I'll press Control X and let's use another very common one. If I press Shift A, go to the search, I could search for a hue saturation value, and that's going to edit the hue, the saturation, and the value. So I'll drop this here. So the hue is going to actually change the colors, and then the saturation will make the colors more saturated or less saturated, so you can make it black and white, and the value is going to make the colors lighter or darker. Let's press Control X. There's another cool one for color correction. So if I press Shift A for the add menu, I can go to the search and I could search for the RGB curves. Let's add the RGB curves, drop this here. And the RGB curves, this is similar to the other curves which we used earlier in the tutorial series. So you can click to add a dot and you can drag it up here or drag it down here to make it lighter or darker. You could also click and drag and put a little dot right here, and then you could click to add another dot and you could like drag this dot down and just add a tiny little bit of a curve, and that makes it a little bit more contrasty. You can also press the M key to mute the curve or unmute the curve, but I'm really not going to use this. I don't really need to do any color correction, but you could use this for color correction. So I'll press Control X. Another one you could use if you go to the search is the brightness and contrast. Drop this here. So this is very simple. You can make things brighter, just turn that way up, or you can make things more contrasty. I'll press Control X again. Now another really cool node which we're actually going to use in this scene is a glare. So I'll press Shift A for the add menu again. We can go to the search, and this time we'll search for glare, and let's drop the glare here again in between the wire, and this is going to have many different options. So let's click on the medium here on this quality, and let's change it to high so it's high quality. So we'll just wait for that to composite. And actually when it's high quality, you can see the glare is smaller. So just for now, let me change it to low quality so you can see it's a bit bigger now. So you can kind of see wherever there's really light areas, that's where the glow is going to come up. And there's many different settings here. You could click on the streaks and you could change it to ghosts. So ghosts is kind of going to make that kind of effect. And then there's also streaks here. And then there's also fog glow. This is probably the main one that I use. It kind of just makes like a glow around the light areas. And then there's also simple star. You can see this is going to kind of make some stars. That actually looks pretty cool. Now there's also the iterations, and so if you turn this way up, there's going to be more of them. And there's also a mix here, so if you drag the mix value, it's going to like change the contrast. So if I just turn the mix up a little bit, let's just turn it up to like a 0.1, and that's actually a little bit too small, maybe like a 0.5. You can see now it's making everything darker, and you can see that glare better. Let's maybe change it to like a 0.9, and now everything is really dark and you can just see that glare. I'll turn this back to 0. Now there's also a threshold, so if your bright parts aren't bright enough, you can change the threshold. So if I turn the threshold down, then it's going to make every little light part very bright, or if I turn the threshold up, it's only going to use the very bright areas. So I could turn this to like a 0.5, and now you can see it's choosing all those bright areas, but I'll turn this back to just 1. And then we can also kind of fade this if we want to make it a bit stronger or make it less strong. So what I'm going to do is just press Control X to get rid of it. I'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to search for another one just so that we're back to the default settings. So I'll drop it here. So what I like to do generally is I just change the streak to fog glow, and I change the medium to high. That's usually all I do. And then if you want it to be even stronger, you could do more of them. So I could press Shift D to duplicate, drop it here so you can have 2 of them, and that'll make it like a little bit stronger. All right, so we're almost done. We're almost ready to save the image, but something that I want to show you is how to add a vignette. And a vignette is a little dark area which is around the image, and it kind of brings your eyes into the center of the image. So let me show you an easy way to add a vignette to your images in the compositor. So if you press Shift A for the add menu, you can go to the search, and you can search for a box mask. Let's click on the box mask, and I can drop it here, and I can click in the corner and drag it out to make it bigger. And then I can Control Shift and select the box mask to preview it. So you can see everything is black, but then the box is white. And you can drag this width value to make the box bigger, and then also the height value, and you can also move it around if you want to. So I'm just going to make the width and the height pretty big. So there's basically a black box out here, and then there is a white box right here. So now what I can do is I can add a node to blur this box. So if I press Shift A, go to the search, I can search for the blur node. Let's drop the blur right here, and then we're already previewing it because the viewer node is plugged up to it. So then what I want to do is change both of these values at once. So I can click on the top one, then I can drag down, and then I can just drag left and right. And you can see as I turn this up, it's going to be more and more blurred. And so for my scene, I'll maybe just do like a 250, something like that. We can change it later. And also this box mask, we can kind of make this a bit smaller so you can see it a little bit better. So you can drag the width and the height to make it a little bit smaller. And then maybe the X and Y values, maybe I'll turn this to like a 400 instead, something like that. So now we can add it to the final image. So what we want to do is we just want to add this image where the light parts are, and we only want to be able to see those little black areas on the edges. So I'm going to click and drag to select these glares, and I can drag them over. And then I can Control Shift and select the reroute just to preview that again. So to mix these two together, I can press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the alpha over node. Let's click on the alpha over and drop it here. And this alpha over node is pretty similar to the mix color node, which we used in the shader nodes. So you can see there is a factor which will control what part is this image and what part is this image. And so we can mix them together. So what I'll do is I will take this blur and I'm going to put that into the factor. So the factor is determining what parts are going to be the top image and what parts are going to be the bottom image. And then this glare here, we can put this one into the bottom image. So now we'll just wait for this to compile, and it's going to flip the values. So now you can see that the vignette is really white and there's a white area around the image, but I don't really want it to be white. So if I click on this image color here, I can just turn this all the way to black and just make it completely black. So now I can just wait for this to finish. It's going to composite. And there we go. So you can now see we have that nice vignette, and it's adding just a little dark area around the image. And that might be a bit too strong. So I can actually click on this height and drag it over. If I select the box mask, it'll show us where that is by adding that box there. So I can drag this up and also drag this out. You could also change the amount of blur if you wanted to change that, but I'll just wait for this to composite because it's a little bit too strong, and that is a bit better. So you can see now it's just adding that little dark area around the image, and it kind of brings your eyes into the center. So now I'm going to show you how to save the final image. Now there's a few ways to do this. One thing you can do is you can press the F11 key, and F11 is going to take you to the render result. Another way to do this, if I hit the X key, is to just click right here on rendering. And rendering is also going to take you here to this image editor, and it will show you the render result. Now, you might notice that this doesn't actually have the finished compositing. That's because you can see this is the render result, but this isn't the compositing. So to preview the compositing, you can click on this drop-down arrow, and you can start to type viewer node. And if you click on the viewer node, this is going to show you what the viewer node can see in the compositing. So whatever this viewer node is plugged up to, if I go back to rendering, that's what it's going to see. Then to save this image, you can click here on image, and you can click on Save As. And then in your project files, you can rename this. So I'll just rename it to Snowman. And then if you press the N key to open the side panel, you can choose some settings. So you could choose the file format. I would either go with PNG or JPEG, and then you can click on Save As Image. Now another way to do this, if I click back here on the compositing, another way is to select the viewer node and make sure it's selected. Then you can press the N key to open the side panel, and you're going to click here on this little node tab. And then you can click on Save This Image. And then you can do the same thing, so you can rename it, and then you can click on Save As Image. Alright, so with that finished, this is going to wrap up my Blender for Beginners complete tutorial series. So I hope you had fun following along with the tutorial series, and I hope you learned a lot about Blender, and thank you so much for watching. And I really hope that now you have a good grasp and basic understanding of the Blender fundamentals. And so now you can hopefully create your own basic projects, and you can also watch more advanced tutorials because you now know the basics of Blender. And if you followed this entire tutorial series, and if you finished creating the snowman, then you can send a snowman emoji in the comments to let me know that you finished the entire tutorial series. Now you might be wondering what you can watch next to learn more about Blender. Well, pretty much all of my videos on my YouTube channel are created for kind of beginner to intermediate Blender users. So now that you've watched this beginner tutorial series and you know the basic fundamentals of Blender, you really should be able to follow any of the videos on my YouTube channel. Because again, my videos are really not super advanced. My videos are all made for beginner to intermediate users. So I do kind of say some of the shortcut keys. I don't go super fast. I don't jump over too much. So if you're just kind of a beginner to intermediate user, then you can pretty much follow along with any of the videos on my YouTube channel. Now, if you still feel like you need a better grasp of Blender, then I actually have a Blender fundamentals tutorial playlist. And in that playlist, I have many different fundamental videos like lighting for beginners, rigid body physics for beginners, compositing for beginners, shader nodes for beginners, and many other fundamental topic videos. And that playlist is also great to watch if you have something specific which you want to learn more about, because in each video I go into more depth and give you a complete introduction to that part of Blender. Now, I've also become known for creating procedural materials because I just keep on making all these procedural material videos on my YouTube channel, and I've now created a massive tutorial playlist with over 100 procedural materials. And so you can check out that tutorial playlist if you're interested in learning more about procedural materials and you want to create your own procedural materials. And as I create more procedural materials, I'll keep on adding more material tutorials to that playlist. Now, animation is something that we haven't got into in this tutorial series. There were just so many things that I wanted to cover that I didn't really cover animation, but I actually have an animation for beginners tutorial. You can also check out that video if you want to learn the basics of animation. And also, if animation is something that you really want to get into and you want to have a complete course to really learn the basics, fundamentals of animation, then I highly recommend checking out P2 Design's A Live Animation course. And that course is packed with so much animation content, and I actually have an affiliate link to that animation course in the description. So if you purchase the animation course through my link, then I'll earn a small commission, but it won't cost you anything extra. And I can highly recommend that course. It's very detailed and thorough. thorough, there are lots of videos, and it will teach you so much about animation. And also I did mention this at the very starting of the tutorial series, but another beginner series which I highly recommend is CG Boost's Launchpad course. So if you still feel like you need a grasp of the basics of Blender, then I definitely recommend CG Boost's Launchpad course. It's a large course and it will really teach you so many fundamentals of Blender. And I do have an affiliate link in the description to that course, so again, if you purchase that course through my affiliate link, that's a great way to help support me and it won't cost you anything extra. Now, if you're looking for lots of Blender resources and Blender tools, as well as procedural materials, 3D models and assets, and so much more content, then definitely consider checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. So on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, you can get access to lots of Blender content like 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node setups, and so much more Blender content on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. So because of all my supporters, I'm able to keep on creating these free tutorials on YouTube. So thank you everyone so much for your support. And of course, I have literally hundreds of Blender tutorials on my YouTube channel, so definitely check out my YouTube channel for so many more Blender tutorials. So that will finish it up for this tutorial series. So again, thank you so much for watching the entire tutorial series, and I hope you enjoyed creating the snowman, and I hope it gave you a good basic understanding of the fundamentals of Blender. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in one of my future videos.